I'm Bridget Marmion, and welcome to the YA Today, where a leading editor, agent, and blogger will discuss the YA book, the audience, and the crossover. But before the introductions, some logistics. Could I have the first slide, please? For our attendees here at Union Square and across the country, please note our hashtags. Hashtag the YA Today, hashtag YA Writer, and hashtag YenConfab, because we do certainly encourage tweeting by attendees and speakers throughout our conversation today. And especially for our online attendees, if you're unable to hear us or to see us, please email richardpkelly@gmail.com. You'll be able to see Richard's email throughout the evening at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. And I do want to let everybody know that we are recording the event tonight, just in case any of your friends you realize later would have enjoyed or benefited from hearing this information. For probably about a week from now, the YA Today will be available up on our website. So our format tonight is going to be very conversational, with our panelists in conversation with each other on the questions and the subjects that I certainly can't wait to hear more about. And do let us know throughout the evening if there's any further explanation or amplification that you do need. But I do want to let you know that probably around 7:10 that we'll have formal Q&A session. And of course, if you're outside the room, do send those questions directly to Rich Kelly. So if you could go back to us live, please, so I can properly introduce our speakers today. I'm Bridget Marmion, and my background is over a decade each at Random House, Houghton Mifflin, and at Farris Chalcheru in sales, publicity, and marketing, mostly as Senior VP of Marketing. And I'm very proud to say that at both FSG and at Houghton, I was responsible for the marketing of children's books as well as adult books. And I've long learned not to even try to summarize the background of my esteemed guests. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. So Emilia, would you mind?
Sure. I am a senior editor at HarperCollins, where I work primarily on YA titles. I do a little bit of middle grade too, but we won't talk about that tonight. I don't know. I think that covers it.
Well, I will continue for Emilia because she used to work at Alloy as well, which is when I first met her.
Okay.
Right? Or
Yeah.
was it at Simon & Schuster?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I've been
Alloy.
at Simon & Schuster. I was at Alloy Entertainment on the development side also, but have always been focused on YA.
But talk a little bit about Alloy, because theirs is an interesting business model which does spread beyond books.
Yes, it does. So they are a bit like a production company, except not exactly. They do a lot of content development. So you might know them from Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars, Vampire Diaries, some of those big properties. And so they do a lot of content development in-house, work with writers, and then do the book side, which leads things, and also do TV and film outside of that. So it's a bit of a blend of agenting and editorial, I guess.
A really interesting perspective in all the worlds that really matter to a teen, I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
And over to Pete Knapp.
So my career also started with a bit of a blend, as Emilia said. I worked at a scouting company called Floor and Shape Productions, and we worked with film entities out in California, and our job was to basically find and read manuscripts that could potentially be adapted into movies. And so I kind of had one foot in Hollywood, one foot in publishing, and very quickly decided I liked the left foot that was in publishing a little more, and so I jumped over to an agency called the Park Literary Group, and I worked there for 4 years. Park Literary did primarily commercial women's fiction and upmarket fiction as well. So they represented Janice Lee and Nicholas Sparks, Debbie May Comer, and others as well. And it was fantastic. And while I was there, I started building my own list of children's authors. And because I wanted to focus primarily on middle grade and young adult fiction, though I do now a little bit of adult fiction, but in any case, because I was doing primarily middle grade and young adult fiction, I decided to go to an agency that had a more robust list on that side, just because being in that context is, I think, helpful for me and certainly for my clients as well. And so now I work at New Leaf Literary. I joined there in July of 2015, so almost my year anniversary, and I love it.
Wonderful. Katie.
Hi, I'm Kate, and I run a blog called Babbling about books and more. My screen name is Katiebabs, and I've been running it. It'll be 9 years come September. 8 years. Started in September 2008. And I mainly review and promote and spotlight romance and young adult, among other quirky things. And I'm also a self-published and digital author of romance under KT Grants. So from blogging, because I love writing, I also started publishing, and since 2010 I have about 30 titles out. So I still blog because I like to promote authors, and because I love reading romance, and as somebody who will be, my birthday's in a few days and I'll be turning a certain age milestone, I won't say, I like still young adult, which I started reading after college, so yeah.
In fact, it was interesting because before we all came together, Kate was mentioning that she started reading romances at around 13 years old. And from my work with Harlequin and their extensive research, they do know that most people read their first romance at 14 years old. So you were right on target.
A little precocious.
Yes, actually
A little ahead of the curve.
my first, well, they'll say it's a romance. My first romance was Gone with the Wind, even though it doesn't have the happily ever after. But my next books, my mother by accident bought me Harlequin Super Romance in 8th grade. And I came from a very sheltered childhood, so I knew the mechanics of sex and love, but with those super Harlequin romances, that's when I just got hooked on romance. I went to the library and basically took out every book I could get my hands on, not just romance, and I learned an appreciation for the classics, especially Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. So from Harlequin, I started reading a lot of classic literature too, so.
Have I mentioned we're going to be talking about crossover books?
And young adult, so. Because young adult has a lot of the young adult I read has a lot of romance, and that's an interesting discussion because a lot of people assume now young adult is all mainly romance, which it isn't, so.
So now that we've told you who we are, we'd love to hear a moment, a few minutes, or a few seconds each of who you are. So would you tell us who you are?
Hi, my name is Davia, and I work for Gotham Ghostwriters, a ghostwriting agency. I'm the associate there. I am also a writer. I have my first film in development right now, so yeah.
You know Rachel Gressler?
Yes,
I love Rachel.
I worked with her.
She used to work at Park Literary.
Fabulous.
Yeah, love her.
And if we're not jinxing things, can we ask, is your property in development a YA or an adult?
It's actually an adult thriller. So.
Very good luck. And next to Davia is?
I'm Barbara Clark. I am a literary agent. I do not represent young adult books, but I have two clients, one whom I'm helping to self-publish and another who is at work on a novel. And both of them have asked me about YA and is this book a YA? And I think, let me get some information.
We can help you answer that.
And Gloria.
Gloria Contingere. I'm actually a recent college graduate from Princeton, and I work at Bloomberg now. I came down. I love watching the panels on YouTube, so I figured I should come along in the area and experience it for myself.
Oh, great.
Yeah, happy to meet you guys.
And do you come with interest as a writer or working in publishing, or?
Both. I have interest in the industry, but also
Well, that's exciting. And now I want to let you know who's out there, because I regret that we can't hear each of you out there personally, but I will let you know that we have some authors out there listening in. Yolanda Srica, Kayla Olson, Eliza Zayed, as well as a PR and publicity professional, Jen McGuire, and perhaps joining us a little bit late, but joining us will be another wonderful blogger, Alexa Loves Books. So I think I've mentioned everyone. And joining us perhaps a little bit later in our Union Square offices will be another writer, Anne Marie Cunningham. So now that we all know a little bit about each other, I'm going to say a couple of words about the YA market, just so that we're all dealing with the same common information. And I have to tell you that I didn't realize till I started researching it for this event, because I thought I was the only one having a hard time finding this data, until my very good friend Krista McLean said, no, Bridget, there actually is not an easy way to find YA-specific information, because not until this fall will there be a YA-specific BISAC code. So that's the good news, that starting this fall there will be a YA BISAC code. But until then, may I have the next slide, please? We are going to use the data that is available. And unless you do a very sophisticated blend of Bowker and Bookstat information, most information you will see is a blend of both young adult and children's publishing. And the net revenue, you should know, for the young adult and children's book publishing in 2014 represents $2.87 billion. And in the past decade, the YA category has exploded significantly. In fact, the statistics show that it grew about 50% in the year 2014, according to the American Publishers Association. Fueled to a certain degree by certain movies, but it was on that trend anyway. And in fact, in 2014, findings suggest that the popularity of YA books and ebooks was even keeping many book publishers afloat in the age of e-readers and self-publishing. Now, this particular slide shows the huge increase in the number of YA titles and the number of YA ebooks from 2002 to 2012. So the black is 2002, and the red on the left is 2002 on the bottom in black, 2012 in red is 2012. And then on the right is a bar chart that shows who's buying those YA books. Because part of the appeal and part of these huge sales jumps are due to the ageless appeal of the YA book. What stunned me is to see, and it's too hard to read this far away, but 35% of YA books are bought by those 18 to 29 years old. And 27% of YA books are bought by those 30 to 44 years old. And in fact, this is the easy thing to remember, only 16% of YA books are bought by those 13 to 17 years old, per this report, which is a blend of Bookstat and Bowker Books and Print. And one thing I do want to point out tonight, while we're talking about crossover books, I am talking about books that are YA books crossing over into the adult market, as opposed to adult books which do cross over into the young adult market, such as Virgin Suicide and a great multitude of other books we could mention. But tonight when we talk crossover, we're talking about books published as YA books, which then broaden and sell up to the adult market. And the next slide, please. If that influence wasn't enough, that almost $3 billion worth of sales and those age stats, on the left you're going to see the incredible increase in the number of adaptations to film and to TV. Again, in black is 2002, in red is 2012. And on the left is the YA books that were adapted into film, and on the right is the YA books. The dots represent the YA books adapted into TV. And I'm sure that our colleagues here who have worked in TV and film lived through this. But you can see the enormous explosion of books, YA books, that then influenced the production in both film and TV. But this is what actually is great measurement of influence, and frankly, quite a bit less obvious. When you look at the Twitter followers, John Green, with almost 1.8 million Twitter followers, has more Twitter followers than Nicholas Sparks, Michael Pollan, Dan Brown, and Malcolm Gladwell combined. So yes, it's a very profitable, growing, powerful, and influential market. And we're going to learn a lot more about it today. So let's come back live, please. So now we can hear from our experts on the book, the audience, and the crossover. And I'm going to ask Emilia to start. And let's start at the beginning again, so we have common information, common knowledge, which is, what is a YA book these days? When you say YA, and let's talk from the acquisitions position, what age range do you generally perceive a book from?
Age range of protagonist?
Reader.
Or reader?
Reader.
Okay. It's like two different answers.
But, and give those both answers, because that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it might be helpful to try to first define what makes a book YA,
Yes,
and frame it that way, and then we can talk about the reach, because I think that is a lot of the questions that people have often. Typically, there are always, outliers to the rules, but I would say with protagonists between the ages of 14 and 18, we see the bulk of YA being on the higher age range of protagonists, but with that 14 can be a bit of a trickier space, and then it comes down to what the content is and what that 14-year-old is going through. But a lot of the YA that you'll see on the shelves, it's 17, 18, 16-year-olds. So that is at the core, that's what it is. But then things start to get a little tricky. You can think of many books published on the adult side that have teen protagonists that are not in the YA shelves. So really what it comes down to is, what is the perspective? What is the point of view in which you are reading that story of a teenager? So a lot of, like, Virgin Suicides, as being an example, is an adult book because it is told from the point of view of looking back at the time of being a teenager. You're not immediately in it. You have the perspective of having grown up, having that experience outside of it. Sometimes there are also blends. I think Megan Abbott is an interesting blend. If you know any of her work, she's an adult writer that often has teenage protagonists, but she usually has an adult point of view in there also. So her book Fever, I think maybe her most recent, has two teen protagonists that they are exactly narrating from the moment that they are a teenager, but then you also get their dad. And so that really pushes it outside of being a YA novel. It's really about that immediacy of the emotion and being in the moment and going through the angst, which I honestly think is what people who aren't teenagers are still drawn to. They like that emotional immediacy, and I think that's why people are drawn to it that they might not get on the adult side. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add. Please chime in if you.
No, I mean, to me that's definitely right. I feel like the thing that definitely makes me feel like a book is an adult book, because every once in a while as an agent you get a book that's queried to you as a YA book, and you read it and you're like, no, this actually feels more adult, or more often you get an adult book that feels more YA, and I do think it is that immediacy. And I'm trying to think of an example like The Age of Miracles, which was an adult book but has, I think, a 12-year-old protagonist. But there's such a distance to the voice in terms of it's truly being told I mean, from when she's maybe 18 or something, but there's a huge distance between the events and the perspective it's being told from. And so I think that distance is, again, as Emilia said, what pushes it into the adult category. And then also, I think when I'm talking to editors, even though, as your statistics show, it's mostly adult readers actually buying the bulk of YA books, they're still publishing for teens. When they're thinking about the acquisition, they're thinking not, oh, we could make this work for adults even if the teens won't buy it. They're thinking we have to make it, it has to work for the teens, and then the adults will come because the adults like those books too.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
I said, no, I agree with that 100%. We market to teens, we publish for teens, and adults are a very, very nice gravy.
Did you want to add something, Kate?
No, I was going to say, like the audience, knowing, like you said, it's markets towards the teen audience and for the teen reader, and the plus is having an adult read it. Maybe the adult can read it with their teens. A lot of, I think parents do that. They read with their children, and as their children get older, it's something that bonds them, knowing that the mother or father can talk to their teen at that time, because teenagers can be, they don't want to, you know, if you remember when you were a teen, you didn't want your parents around, so they have like a book that they can bond over. It's an extra plus too.
And also the Philistine here will point out that the movie has a lot to do, the surge of movies based on YA books have a lot to do with bringing adults into the fold. You know, that is, like any good movie can generate, thank heavens, great selling books. So I think that also is a factor. People who would not come across the book otherwise. But then
well, with the movie too, you just have to keep in mind the marketing budgets for books is to say a fraction is not even is not even covering it in terms of what you get once you have a movie. You're talking about a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign, so the awareness is just phenomenal.
And the word of mouth it can spark.
Yep,
When it's
definitely.
all done, the characters it can introduce. So are there any specific, because the library world and the book selling world is a equally important part of this as well. Is there anything any factors that must be included to classify a book as a YA these days? And also I've got to ask while you're in the room, is anybody using the term new adult, or am I the only one?
Well, new adult is just a completely separate thing. I think people use the term, it's been a very, very confusing term for a lot of people of what classifies something as new adult. Some people have viewed it as just being sexual content, which isn't what makes a book new adult. A lot of the successful ones did. So new adult, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you can help me define this. It's honestly a really tricky thing, and I don't publish it.
So.
It's completely amorphous. New adult should be between 18 and 29 protagonists with the same kind of immediacy of being in that moment. That's in theory what it should be. It's not what it has turned into. A lot of the really tricky piece, and I think part of why new adult has been so confusing and it has had a harder time taking off, the shelving when you walk into a bookstore, new adult never really existed. Some romance categories have determined certain shelf space for that, but it doesn't have the shelf space that YA has. So I think that has been a bit of a confusing piece of that. Sometimes we will get submissions that are calling themselves YA/new adult, and they just don't know what they are. And there are some, you know, if you take that determination, I think Rainbow Rowell's Fangirl is an interesting example where that book takes place in a girl's freshman year of college. And so in really strict terms could be a little bit questionable of does that exactly fit in the YA space. On one hand, she's Rainbow Rowell. She can get away with whatever she wants and everyone will read it. And I love Fangirl. It's amazing.
She
and then when you
wrote the book that Fangirl has in it just to prove that point.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. But I think when you read it, it still feels like a YA book, even though the girl is in her freshman year of college. She's dealing with that immediacy of emotions. She's still trying to figure out how to be an adult. She's very much in that in that conflicted space, whereas new adult should be more in the sense of like figuring out your career, where your future is going, where your path is going, that YA doesn't really cover. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's a really tricky space that I think a lot of people have spent time trying to figure out.
I think new adult came out of adults reading young adult, and then new adult is really rise because of self-publishing. And I believe because self-publishing, there's not set rules. So you had a lot of adults reading the 18 to like even 30s or 40s that are reading young adult, and they want something more adult, like that college experience where they might show more adult situations that young adult literature doesn't have. So new adult, it is hard to define because you have a lot of new adult that I prefer is set in college. So you have like a freshman or sophomore, but they still have, like they're in that moment, they might still have those attributes as a 16 or 17-year-old, but then some have that adult, on the cusp of adulthood. They're going to be independent, be out in the world, but they're not there yet. So it's going to be interesting to see, like you're talking about the basic codes. Will it ever have its own separate code that fiction has, or will it still be, you know, in between like romance, or because a lot of new adult seems to have come out of romance, which I can't really think of many new adults that don't have a romance subplot, or it's not like the two main protagonists fall in love and that's the main plot.
I think part of that is because so much of new adult is happening in the self-publishing space. My understanding of the history is it was actually coined by Dan Weiss, who was at Macmillan at the time as a marketing term. But then there wasn't actually any, as Emilia said, shelf space for it. And so of course in self-publishing is where new adult made sense and could work because they didn't need the shelf space. They were publishing through digital platforms. And so it really was able to take off there. But it seems like it had this moment where there were these self-publishing books that were working in new adult that then could find a traditional deal because they had the sales momentum to get a traditional publisher on board and to see the potential. But it seems like the new adult acquisitions have slowed down significantly since that first little blip, and it's now gone back towards primarily self-published books. And I think it is that issue of it's a little hard to figure out how to publish it. And I think with Fangirl, it was an interesting example because, as Emilia said, it read very much like Eleanor and Park in that it read like a YA novel. It was that character and dialogue-driven story that you kept turning the pages, but it had such depth and immediacy.
Situations.
Yeah, in situations, but it was also published by St. Martin's, which is a publisher that does both kids' books and adult books. So it's in some ways the perfect, but it's definitely the perfect publisher to get away with that too, because they can very easily bridge those two markets.
But what you all use sooner or later as you're describing this is voice. And that ultimately, and this, one thing that I know from working with editors and agents as well who have to work as closely with the editorial process is that good editors and good agents are born with a third eye. And they know and see things that sometimes have never happened, so there's not a neat circle to put that new circle in. And that's where trying to define voice comes in. You know it when you feel it, or you know it when you read it. Because I think that being the mom of two, a 28-year-old and a 17-year-old, there is something very specific that teens look for. They're, I think, the toughest audience ever on anything, especially on mothers, but that's another, that's the source of another.
They'll call you out on anything,
But I do think that in terms of, the category of books we're talking about, if you don't get the voice exactly right, it's not the plot that matters. It's probably the situations. And actually there was a great VA panel on it, which we'll circle back to in a moment, but I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more about that when it comes to, if it's possible for you to articulate when you feel a book define itself as a YA or not a YA because of how the voice feels to you.
I think it's really hard to define certain characteristics. I think a huge piece of it is you know it when you see it. I think sometimes when that issue becomes magnified is when we see some adult writers now trying to transition and write for YA. Some can do it and some cannot. And you know that. I think a huge piece of it, I think it was Lisa McMahon once said, and I'm probably going to not exactly say the exact quote. Can I swear on this? Because she's like YA is adult books without the bullshit. Like that's how she puts it. Of you have to respect your audience and treat them with respect. And a lot of adult writers that I think unsuccessfully try to write YA, they're talking down to them, and they aren't respecting them for who they think they are. Now I'm like thinking of actual examples. If I come across in writing in a submission and I see that some character is saying, but I'm a teenager, or referring to themselves as a teenager, my flag raises. Like, no teenager actually views themselves as that category. That is a thing that we have put on them. They don't view themselves that way. They think everything that they do is completely justified. It's not because they're hormonal and a teenager. They're in that moment. They think they're an adult. Like, they think they're ready for these things. And so when you see people really trying and pretending and not having that authenticity, you can tell. So I think that doesn't answer all of the voice questions that you're asking, but it's part of what I look at.
I think one of the big traps that I see authors fall into in terms of speaking down or kind of that inauthenticity is just overly snarky or negative, like that teenager who's just complains all the time. And I think that's
cynicism is right on.
Yeah, that's the thing we see way too much. And it's not, I mean, no reader wants to read that character for the most part. And there's, it's a fine line. Sometimes you can get away with the, maybe John Green-esque overly precocious character who has a few witty things to say here and there, although that's probably been overdone at this point too. But there's a difference between that and the character who is just negative and just views the world negatively and, again, snarky and over the top. And it seems like they drank like 9 Mountain Dews.
Katie, anything you want to add to that?
Because reading both, I feel like with adult fiction, adults will do more internal, dissect situations more and think of the future, whereas teens are more like, all right, if I do this, they don't internalize so much. There's been some young adult books where it goes on for pages where the main protagonist is thinking about A through Z, and I'm going, no, sometimes teenagers just I remember when I was a teenager, if I had a crush on a boy, I would think of okay, we're gonna get together and maybe we'll go on a date, but then I wouldn't be well, what's his future going to be? Is he going to have a good job? I just feel like teens are more, they're not so internal. They'll think a little bit, but then they'll do some actions. I mean, I guess they're maybe a little bit more emotional, but I notice with adult fiction, a lot of, especially speaking of romance, you'll have the heroine or hero go on for a few pages thinking about their lives and if they should be with this person, what's the outcome. So I don't think teens obsess so much about
He's obsessed about different.
They different than oh, what am I gonna, I needed, I just feel like there's just, when somebody a writer or author, you just can tell. It's hard to put, but what you both said is pretty much what I agree. You just know.
I didn't plan to bring up, but now you remind me of lunch last week with a very distinguished editor. We wound up talking about how many complaints there are from so many different quarters that books are too long. Now I'm talking to an editor, talking about not just because she's supposed to do 15 books a year, but just in general. Now you're looking at somebody who remembers in the 70s, Harry Hoffman, who was head of Walden Books, announcing no book should be longer than 192 pages. I was working at Farrar Straus at that point. You can imagine how Roger Strauss reacted to that. He didn't embrace the concept, let's say, because that, of course, was the mall mentality versus the literary mentality. It was how it was perceived then. So it's very interesting to me that now, this many years later, I hear this comment from an editor who works at a very distinguished house. But within the last 2 weeks, I heard the same thing from someone who's an architect and an academic who reads all kinds of nonfiction and someone else who reads all kinds of fiction. Now, Harry Potter changed things tremendously and reassured people that kids are not afraid of reading. They're not afraid of reading long. They're not afraid of reading a series of long books. Just keep the characters great, keep the story great, and we'll be with you. But I'm wondering if what I've just said, the perception that books are getting too long, and I'm not the only one saying this, is something that resonates with any of you guys.
I mean, I think Harry Potter is an interesting example. Obviously, it's such an outlier that there's only so much you can take away from it, but the first book was not that long. I mean, it was still longish for middle grade at the time. But, you know, I think it was 75,000 words or somewhere around there. And then obviously from there, they got much longer to the point.
Even shorter for the first one.
Yeah, maybe.
I think it's only 200 pages. I don't know.
Anyways, it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
quick, and then it grew. But it's almost like you have to get the fans in the door first, and so I think that sometimes publishers, I mean, for one, when publishers are running their P&L, right, they're putting in the number of pages that it's going to be more or less, or I don't know, Emilia might know more about that, but yeah, you're
about that. Yeah.
but you know, you're putting in the approximate number of pages, so that can affect the viability of the project. But also, it's just, I think for the young adult audience, sometimes having a first book in a series be really long might be somewhat intimidating, although I do think they're getting much longer, and it's fine. Like Illumini was quite a doorstop, and it did well. Same with The Diviners by Libba Bray is a really long book, and it did well. So I think you can get longer. I don't mind a long book. I can tell you on the adult side, like I always get excited. One of the books I read recently was A Little Life, and that's, you know, a nice big book. The Goldfinch is another really long book, and I feel like for me, when I'm reading an adult book, I get really excited. It's like, this is something that I'm really going to get to live in for a while. Maybe, though, when I'm considering children's books, I do see the word count because that's usually in the query letter. And when I see that it's over a certain point, usually I think, is this something with someone who overwrites, and is this going to be someone who hasn't done the work of figuring out how to tell the story in a little more streamlined of a way?
While you're saying that, Pete, I'm reminded of the comment from this editor is that, and she's younger than I am, but she saw the difference as soon as writers started working with computers. Because back when authors had to write their books either longhand or type them out, they were more streamlined.
That's so interesting.
And I'll tell you who the editor is when we're off camera, but the bottom line is that because you're doing more self-editing, because you actually are thinking through, do you really want this? Do you really need that sentence? And you have to type the whole thing, you have to mimeograph the whole thing. But the computer, in a lot of ways, almost makes it too easy to add. So there's not the same self. And we're making very big generalizations now, but it just intrigued me that this issue has come up in several different circles that don't intersect. I'm the only common thread. So I thought I would just bring that up. So one question that we did have at one point, is it true that the YA and adult line is blurring? You know, what is a YA book worth? I think the question is, does it seem as though books that are published as a YA book are, both in terms of packaging and in terms of vocabulary, does it seem like the line between the adult and the YA book is blurring? And just one example, I'm in the industry. I right now cannot remember whether The Book Thief was published as adult and did a crossover that way, or was published as YA and did a crossover that way. Okay. And then I know that publisher I worked for deliberately adjusted their packaging of YA so that it would appeal to an older reader. And now we all know, in case you don't work in publishing, no matter what age it is that you're jacketing a book, you always age up, because people will always buy a character who looks older than they are on the cover, but you'd never buy a character who looks younger than you. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about level of sophistication, and the whole jacket look is deliberately being done so that the jacket appeal doesn't limit the book to something that a teen or a 20-something would like. They're jacketing them like adult books.
I think definitely as an agent, when I see a cover, one of the first for a YA book, I do definitely think about how will this appeal to the older readers. Assuming the book, it makes sense to think in those terms for the specific book. And I always think of Red Queen as a great example of a book that to me has huge adult crossover appeal. The cover, in considering the cover, Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, and it's just got this great crown that's upside down with blood dripping on it, and the rest of it is silver, and it looks really sophisticated, and it's phenomenal. And I think adults see it and they want to pick it up because it's this really compelling, simple but sophisticated cover. And it's different than I think a lot of other YA covers that had come before it. So in terms of the packaging, as we said earlier, it still has to work for the teens. That is always the primary market, because by making it work for the teens, the idea is that's why you have the adults coming over to it. They want that content that's being marketed towards the teens. And they want that teen experience. Otherwise they can read their adult books. They've got adult books to read. They don't need a YA publisher for that. But I think teens are also becoming more sophisticated and looking for different things now too. So.
Yeah, I would say as far as packaging goes, it's something we keep in the back of our minds, but it's never at the front of our minds when we're looking at something. And it is on a project-specific basis. Some really, we feel are true teen reads that we aren't looking for that crossover appeal. I think when we think about wanting to go for that crossover appeal, it might sound silly or might sound very New York focused, but you think about the subway test of would an adult be embarrassed to be reading this in public on the subway? And it's not really a question that we ask at every cover meeting, but I think that's a little bit of the litmus test that we look for of not wanting to kind of hide behind and feeling like this is a book I feel great about reading, and I think Red Queen completely passes that test. And some of that, I think when you see some of the more crossover titles, it's not always true, but a decent amount of them are more iconic and not featuring teen characters and faces. There are many exceptions to that rule, but when you think about the really heavy hitters, and I think where we're getting more adult readers is on those bigger properties, who of course are then finding other things. But when you think about The Fault in Our Stars and Divergent and Twilight and Hunger Games and some of those really big properties, none of those show the face of a teenager. So I think that is one way we consider it, but there are, Sarah J. Maas shows teenage characters, and she certainly has a lot of adult readers. So I don't mean to make that as a completely blanket rule, because there are a lot of exceptions to it, but it is one way, I think, to go to try to broaden your audience a little bit.
So that's an interesting way to start talking about what does make a good adult YA crossover. And I recognize that asking that question is very much like asking, how do you make something go viral? Because the answer is, you can't. And you've already said the most important thing is to make the book work for the core audience and to jacket the book for the core audience. So that is understood. But having said that, with your experience, I'd love some success stories too, and admitting that it could just be that, stars aligned and something going on, but I'd love some examples of books that did cross over to the adult market, and if there's anything we can learn from those situations.
I feel like young adult dystopian and sci-fi has a big crossover, with Rick Yancey, in the Maze Runner series, and Hunger Games and Divergent. Another book that is not necessarily young adult was The Night Circus. Do you remember that book that came out? But it's funny, The Night Circus, it came out, was it 2012 by Erin Morgenstern? That book, if you have a chance, you have to read it. It starts out with the protagonists are children, and then they're teens, and then they're adults. But the cover, it could drag in teens, but also as an adult. But I felt like that because it has a fantasy element too, the crossover appeal for that. And I think it was marketed as adult fiction, but then people were getting confused, is it young adult? Because it has, so I think for me, young adult fantasy, sci-fi, or dystopian seems to have more of a crossover appeal. But again, I'm not sure if it's because of the movies, because the Divergent series, Hunger Games, Maze Runner, they became such big hits. So I can't think of like any other book that hasn't been into a movie that, like you were mentioning some. Do you know any that this year so far?
Is a really great
Yeah.
example of someone who, Rainbow Rowell is an example of someone who
Eleanor and Park,
hasn't had a movie yet, though I think hopefully someday. But in any case, she obviously has a huge crossover audience. Red Queen is another one, but that one's, as you said, in that space of fantasy, sci-fi, dystopian. I mean, honestly, I think part of it is I think it's a combination of things. I mean, I think the size of the book is what helps it break out of, honestly. It's like how much
I agree.
which part of that comes from how the publisher is positioning it, and how much support it's getting, marketing and everything. And then part of it is just whether it just reaches that tipping point where then it can get into the adult bloodstream and so I think like with Eleanor and Park, I think that probably was not a book they positioned as a huge way, but it had such great, originally when they bought it, but then it had such great in-house support, and it became a really big in-house favorite before it published, and people were talking about it in this big way. And her previous book had been an adult book, and so there was a certain amount of adult carryover there. And it's just a phenomenal read. And then on top of all of that, you have an author who's really phenomenal at connecting with readers on the adult and on the children's side. And so it's sort of like, as you said, it is like asking how to make something go viral. It's the perfect storm.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to get all of these elements in line. But that's why it's great that publishers aren't thinking, oh, does this book make sense for the adult market? Because a book is still worth doing, even if you can't necessarily get to that tipping point.
You can't aim for it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you can aim for it, but you can't count on it.
But I know that author did say that it wasn't until she did Eleanor and Park, because she was a successful adult author, but it wasn't until she did Eleanor and Park that she said had such an incredible engagement with her readers. She always did social media, but it wasn't until the teens that she actually really wound up. Like she's the kind of personality that enjoys it and is good at it and really responds to it. But you could tell just from that interview just how much it fueled her. And that again is a measure of the difference in the audiences.
Mm-hmm.
So that then fuels word of mouth in other ways too. And the author is that personality who.
Yeah, and I do think that to a degree, on the YA side, your readers, as you're saying, they want that connection. It's something they really look for. It's part of why. I mean, you point at John Green's numbers being so high, but you have to remember John Green created that connection outside of the context of his books as well as a vlogger, and so I think that connection helped him reach that tipping point as well. So I feel like that is part of it, is that connection between author and audience, and then being able to use that to get to the tipping point where then it is able to cross over to the adult side. I also do think that a huge part of why adult, I mean, I love YA. It's not, I don't just work in it. I truly love reading young adult books, and a huge part of what I love reading, what I read them for, is that emotional intensity. And so I think when there are those lines that you just really connect with, and they feel like, it feels so true to you as a reader, and it feels like someone's gotten inside of your head, that always helps. And I feel like it's like when an editor who's now an agent, actually, as she put it to me, it's those lines that you want to tattoo onto your skin that feel truly a part of you. And I think those are the sorts of things that help spread word of mouth, because then you have your quotes on Goodreads and you have your quote cards, and people are able to say, oh, this line, this line, this line. I think The Fault in Our Stars really benefited from those highly quotable lines, and I think Everything by Nicola Yoon also has those really highly quotable lines that work outside of the context of the book as well. So I think that's part of it.
And it does, I mean, there's so many different ways we could go on that, but you just reminded me, it always does start with the book, because I'll speak for myself, you don't have to agree with me, but I consider it one of the secrets of publishing, that passion and that build that you talked about with Night Circus, that in-house book that gets that read in-house and becomes an in-house favorite, The impression is that that happens every day in every house. The reality is, I was in publishing in-house for 40 years. And I think genuinely it happened 20 times in my 40 years. And I could name those books, and you guys know those books. Some of them were YA, some of them were presumed innocent, some of them Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I'll go on from there if you want. But it doesn't happen that often. Fun Home, hands down. Sales department didn't want to publish it because we didn't have a list of graphic novels. We said, no, we should publish that book because it's a great memoir. And we did. But the bottom line is that it really does start with the book. But these days, it does matter if the author is a personality that's comfortable on social or does have that ability to connect and use the current toys and tools of marketing to get the word out there. Because John Green would always have been a great writer. But if he didn't have that ability and that, it's not a marketing gene, it's a real genuine ability to use media in a way to help him connect with people. It's like Hugh Howey in the self-publishing world. Hugh Howey is like the poster boy for, do you guys know Hugh Howey, the author of Wolf series? He's like the example of somebody who could be self-published and become everything good. Not everybody is Hugh Howey. Hugh Howey creates a world and invites people into it in a way that a tiny percentage of people have that ability. And John Green is the YA version of that. So I think it's both exciting, the opportunity that there is right now to use media and new media for authors to connect with readers, but I think it also puts a great pressure on those authors who don't have that same kind of personality. It puts pressure on us to help them connect. But then there's still the timeless things that always work. Authors going to, it sounds boring, but it works tremendously. Authors going to schools and building relationships that way. Working through libraries, working through Goodreads. Because I'd love to do a little segue now. What does help market a book? You know, what are the things that in 2016 and 17, if you were in charge of the budget, if you could determine what the budget is on your next books coming out, Peter, what would you want? What do you consider the most important things to do? But what's a big enough budget these days?
I mean, I wish as an agent I got to see the actual dollar amount, but usually we don't.
It's absolutely within your right to ask to know what the marketing.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you always get told. Trust me. Trust me. As Emilia, yeah.
There is that.
Yeah, I do ask sometimes. But I think it's sort of like
I'm not going to let this go. What do you think this day and age? What do you think? Now we're talking about a YA book, okay?
You shouldn't ask me. You should ask Emilia. She works for a publisher. I don't know if she would want to actually tell you a number.
Yeah,
and it's different for every book.
It is, and because some books warrant different approaches.
No, I was a marketing director for 40 years. I'm asking your perception of what, quote, enough money is. Because, ironically, the things that are most effective these days are not expensive in dollars. You're talking to the former head of the Publishers Ad Club. It's not the stuff you pay for that's most expensive. It's about time. Mm-hmm. And, right, every time we give any kind of event talking about publishing, the very first thing I say is that the most successful launches take place these days, began while the author is writing the book. And that is true of YA, as true as it is of any book, because it takes longer to build an audience, longer to get people's attention. Because I'll pull a number out. I would imagine that if an agent was determining which publisher to go with and was told that the budget was $50,000, that you would consider that a significant budget. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, but again, I think it truly depends on the books. Like we have some books that are, six-figure budgets, and then we have some books that have barely any marketing budget, but as you said, it's more about the time and the resources in-house, and so it's more the overhead budget that comes into play there. And so it truly does depend on the book. I think $50,000, I'd be happy with that for a lot of books. Yeah. Very happy. Yeah.
All right, so let's do a more gentle discussion about what matters these days. And I'd love Kate to jump in as well in terms of I'm not going to ask what triggers sales, because that's an impossible question, but what brings a book to the attention of a blogger? If you were doing a YA book, what are the things that you wish a publisher would do for you?
I noticed in the recent 6 months, the online world, it may seem big, but it actually is tiny. A lot of people, they develop relationships, and from that relationships, they use one another to get the word out. And again, I noticed with self-publishing, there's things called street teams where they build a fan base who people will just spread, it's like word of mouth. There's these two authors, Jen Frederick and Elle Kennedy, who write romance separately, decided to join forces to write young adult. And under Aaron Watt, and they're the first self-published young adult author to hit the New York Times digital ebook list for young adults, and they've been there for 6 weeks in the top 3.
And what is the book?
Aaron Watt, it's something princess, but they both have a background. Jen Frederick is a big young adult, a big romance blogger, one of the biggest romance blogs online, Dear Author. She started writing as Jen Frederick. Elle Kennedy started with digital writing with certain publishers like Sam Publishing, has some deals, I think, with Berkeley, and they joined forces. And because they're well respected within the online community with bloggers and authors, they publish the books. It's been 6 weeks and it's been on the New York Times. And because they've established relationships over a certain amount of years, sometimes it takes years. I mean, you'll always have that one book that just, it's a debut and it just skyrockets. But a lot of authors who are now hitting big, like even with John Green, I mean, Fault in Our Stars was like his 7th book, 6th or 7th book. I mean, he was known in YouTube and Blogger. It didn't just happen. So a lot of these hits, sometimes it takes years to develop a fan base. But a lot of it, I know it more the digital, like online end. I know it's like a lot. I mean, even with me blogging for the past 8 or 9 years, we've now gone to Twitter, and when you develop relationships, those relationships work. I mean, you have now editors and agents and authors and readers all interacting together. And I feel like it's more easy when you have those relationships, you can contact them and go, I have a book, can you help me? Because it's no longer like, you don't just email somebody random and they'll be like, no, I'm not gonna help you because I don't know you, but everybody knows one another now. And that's with online, like the blogging community. I know with me blogging, if I mention a book I'm enjoying, I'll put it on Facebook, I'll talk about it on Goodreads, I'll talk it on Twitter, and then my community of bloggers be like, oh, what's this book? What's this book? I mean, there was one book I swore hit the USA Today just because everybody was talking about it online. And it was like, she was barely known, and because everybody was talking about it, she's an Entangled published author. Entangled Publishing is a digital publisher. And I've never heard of her, and I read her, and within that week, she hit like the top 50 in USA Today, and I swear it's because it was all this online chatter. So, I mean, you have it different because you work with budgets, and you do a lot of with magazines and newspapers. But I'm just thinking, it's building relationships, and sometimes it takes a while. I think a lot of people don't realize it's just, a lot of authors have been at it for a while. It's not, like, again, there's always exceptions to the rules, but I know authors that are now, as you say, hitting it big, that have been publishing for 5, 6, 7 years, and they're on like maybe their 20th book. So a lot of it is the social media has done so much. I mean, there's a lot of authors that have used social media to help them, like Hugh Howey or Andy Weir. I mean, he used a blog to post what became The Martian, and it caught Ridley Scott's attention even before he published it. And well, then everything, the rest is history. So sometimes you just get that one person, and you know, just something as simple, if John Green had started tweeting about a certain book, because his fan base and connections, so.
But it does, just that one of the themes of our marketing company is blending the timeless and the newest tools for maximum impact. And building relationships is certainly one of them, because especially now with the loss of borders, which we're all still recovering from, libraries really in many, many cities are first of all, a building community center, but also it's a source of word of mouth, which of course is the holy grail to start the word of mouth that can start online, can start by booksellers talking to each other, which is another powerful network. And it makes me crazy that people will come to us a month before their book is out and then want our help. And I'm sure you run into this sometimes too. And I just want to strangle them, because the reality is that, and I've learned to say this calmly, you'll all be proud of me. As I said, have you got a relationship with your local booksellers? Have you got a relationship with your local librarians? Have you got a relationship with your local trade groups or YMCA or Hadassah? And then they're surprised when they walk into a bookstore, literally the night before the book comes out. And the bookstore is not so interested in getting a book on consignment or doing a signing. Meanwhile, while you're writing that book, how about becoming a patron of that bookstore? How about becoming a patron of that library? Introducing yourself to the circulation director, going to the reading groups, which by the way, most libraries have reading groups now. Support them, and guess what? They'll support you, which circles back exactly to what Kate was saying. It's been true from the beginning of time, it'll be true till the end of time. Because we've been privileged to work with people who do have that caliber of talent to work like a Hugh Howey and like a John Green, but that's not most of the authors we work with. Usually they're much more normal people. Then it does come down to, using the opportunities that they do have, and some of this common sense. But I'd like to talk a little bit now about the editorial and agent submission process. If somebody does want to submit a book to you all, always do it, and don't do it if you ever want to see a book published, advice you might have.
Do you mean just in terms of actually how they submit the book to us, or do you mean in terms of the content of the book, or do you mean anything?
However you'd like to answer the question.
Sure. I mean, there's some basic, I guess, business etiquette things which seem basic, but yet every day you get queries and that don't follow these. So, most agencies have their submission guidelines online, so follow them. They're there. They're generally
straightforward. What a really good idea.
And what else? You want to learn how to write a query letter, and there are plenty of resources online that teach you how to do that. You can also just look at book copy and see how book copy sort of acts as a good model for how to write a query letter and how to basically, concisely tell an agent about your book in a compelling way.
Is there one particular resource or website you think of to how to write a query letter or how to
I
find
actually
an
think the
agent?
best thing to do is, and I don't know the exact, and I'm sure there are multiple places where you can do this, but is to go on to something like a Writer's Digest, and they have places where you can see examples of actual query letters that worked. And so the way I tend to learn is I learn by seeing what is working, and so I think that's the best way to do it. But Google is your friend in general. If you Google and find those top results, most of them will have at least some good information there. Writer's Digest has a lot on query letters. So, that's a big part of it. Obviously do your research in terms of who the agents are you're submitting to. If you, a lot of agencies have you submit to one agent and the agent can say no for the whole agency, and then you're kind of shit out of luck for the rest of the agents there. So make sure you're submitting to the right person up front, and then write a good book. I think the other thing that happens a lot for agents is they get, and I totally understand it, you've written a book and you're excited and you want to get it out the gate, but craft is so important, and taking the time to actually revise the book and to find beta readers and to really get it in as great of shape as possible is essential, because as we saw, there were over 11,000 YA books published last year, and so it's really competitive. And also, even if you manage to be one of those books, you want your debut book to be as great as possible, of course, because it's competitive out there, and it's not just competitive in terms of getting in the door, but then also in terms of getting readers to actually pick up the books and getting the marketing department excited. And so you just always want to put your best foot forward.
In fact, even though I run a marketing firm, I say to people who come to me, starting with your limited budget, spend your first money with a professional editor, because you can edit your own book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I think some people work well that way. I do think you can also work with critique groups, but yeah, the point being, you need someone else who is not directly related to you, giving you an honest assessment of where things stand and where you can push it further. And I think a lot of agents are increasingly very editorial and will be willing to do work before, between when they start representing you and when they send out the first book.
Do you find the query letters are more that you like are very like professional, like, hello, my name is blah blah, this is what I do, or like if they insert a bit of their personality, like more friendly, like they're telling what the book is, but yeah.
And I don't mind either. I don't mind one that's all business, and I don't mind one that has a little bit of their personality. I think some people try and go too far in that direction though, and they're like, I'm really going to stand out by doing this really zany thing and going over the top, or writing only from the perspective of my character in the query letter, or whatever it may be.
I feel like it's like you're applying for a job. I think if you're going to apply for a job.
I mean, I personally always like when a query letter just gets straight to the story, to be honest, when it's like from the first line, tell me about the book, and then tell me a little bit about you at the bottom. That's just my personal preference, because I want to know about the book first. That's what you're selling to me. So, but I know other agents feel differently.
Anything you want to add from the publisher's perspective?
I'm in a little bit of a different position because most of what I get comes from people like Pete of having agented submissions. So it's a little bit of a different process. A lot of it is editors and agents getting to know each other, getting to have the right, finding the right fit and the right match is a big piece of it. I think there's a really wide range, and it depends on the relationship that you have with someone. I don't mind an agent just reaching out to me and saying, hey, I thought you might like this based off of things I've bought in the past or things I've maybe said that I'm looking for. I'm really open in that way. Really, when it comes down to, I won't make any determination based off of a phone call or a pitch letter. I will put all of that aside and I will read the book and see what I think. So I think a lot of that process, I a little bit gloss over it because it really comes down to the voice at the end of the day. So I'm just in a little bit of a different position, though.
And anything you want to add about marketing, or what if publishers would do one thing differently from a perspective of somebody who is on the media end of things, the blogging end?
What catches my attention is being friendly in the pitch. I mean, what is I consider like the blurb, or if the person is explaining the book. Like sometimes I'll get emails for genres I don't read. Like, can you read my World War I middle? Because I don't read those type of books, but sometimes I'll get just. Again, a lot of self-published authors will write me, and a lot of them are just like, hello there, and it's very just, you can tell it was just like, I'm just sending it out. So that's why I like a little bit more personality. But if people are very much like, hi, say my name, I'm a fan of your blog, and then with their blurb, they're trying to sell their book. If it's catchy, just like you said, with a query letter, I can tell they put a lot of thought into it and trying to explain the book the best way they can. I'll want to read it. And I've done that a few times. I took some chances and I read some really good books by authors I wouldn't have picked up otherwise because their introduction was just so like engaging, and how they're describing their book was just like, okay, since you caught me, I want to read it. And
it started, I didn't know we knew.
Yeah, they treat it like, if you're, hi, my name is, how are you? And then, yeah, they didn't, because you get a lot of blind emails and it's just very, very dry emails.
It's also a little insulting. Basically, it's
yeah,
like spam to you.
yeah, that's what it is. And if you can catch me just like being very engaging, and then this is what my book's about. And if you have a good, like, basically what you would the inside of a book, what it's about, then I'm like, okay, I'm definitely gonna read it. I'll definitely pick it up. I don't know if I'll finish it or I'll like it, but there's been a handful of authors now that I read, and I'm like, when's your next book coming out? Because they just blind emailed me, and they were just very engaging in their email, and then we have like a discussion back and forth, and so.
Well, I'm going to hit 2 quick topics, and we're going to go to questions. One is trends, and I love that the New York Times today was cooperative and actually did an article on novels bring World War II to life for a new generation. The latest trend in children's literature is surprisingly old. Historical fiction about World War II is having a renaissance. And then it went on to give 4 examples of YA books related to the World War II. So World War II apparently is going to be the next trend, and by the time we say trend, it's already overpublished, so please don't write any YA books on World War II if you're out there now. But I love that at the book sales, the BEA this year, when they talked about trends, that among the trends they mentioned were diseases, but really interesting diseases, like face recognition diseases and other things. But I wondered if anybody wants to say a word about any trends that you're seeing.
I think we're a little bit in a trendless place at the moment. Fantasy was a thing for a long time, and I think still is a thing too, but there's the way that people, I remember the days of paranormal well, there's nothing like that is an automatic in. It just doesn't exist. And so I think there are little bubbles, and I think to speak a little bit to the article, I'm happy to see that historical fiction is gaining some momentum. I acquired one just a couple months ago, and I'm very excited to just have that door be open in a way it hasn't been before. Do I think it's the next big thing? No. But it's nice to see that we are seeing just some variation in the market. I think really, and Pete spoke to this a little bit earlier, it's getting very competitive. The shelf space is hard to get into. It's hard for agents to sell to publishers. It's hard for us to get our books to stand out on the shelves. That, I think, is forcing us to just have the best writing at the end of the day, and have a great story around it, of course, but I think no one is really chasing anything at the moment. Maybe you feel differently. Maybe you're chasing something.
No, I mean, there are things that I want on a personal level where
Yeah.
I would love to find this kind of story. I love historical fiction, and I would love to find a really great YA historical, and I sold one recently that was also World War II, so I love this article as well. But also, I agree. I don't think this is going to be, I don't think World War II is the next vampires or dystopian or something like that. I think there are bubbles, as Emilia said, but really it's just about the writing, or every once in a while you see a concept where like this concept really stands out for whatever reason in the market. And feels big, and it's sort of, it when you see it, but you can't say what it is, because if you could say what it is, then then you would just feed it to one of your writers and you'd be brilliant and rich. So, but I do think that it is really, you want those books that feel special and that feel like you love them, and you'll be willing to do all of the work that goes into supporting it beyond the sale, but also the books that hopefully will get that in-house support and enthusiasm, and that we'll just get that great word of mouth again. So.
Well, one of the fun part about being in the room with editors and agents and bloggers is to hear something new coming or a recent book of theirs that they're excited about. So I'm going to ask you that, but I am going to first report that, having had lunch last week with Margaret Ferguson of Margaret Ferguson Books, FSG imprint, she has many books and loves all of them, but she could not stop talking about Calvin. Calvin by Maureen Levitt is a book about a 17-year-old boy who has long identified with Calvin and Hobbes. And it's then, I guess he's diagnosed with schizophrenia and decides that if the creator of Calvin and Hobbes does just one more episode, or does one more cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes, he'll be cured. So Calvin is a book I recommend to all of you. And now I'm going to ask Emilia to talk
Book
about.
we're excited about. I worked on a debut that comes out at the end of August called The 1,000th Floor that I am very excited about.
Me too.
Oh, good. By Catherine McGee. It is really fun and really smartly done. Basically, the concept is set 100 years in the future, but it is not a dystopian by any means. No catastrophic event, no evil government. Like, it's just our world as it continued to develop technologically. In the center of Manhattan has been built a 1,000-story skyscraper. It's so big that Central Park fits within it, and it's a multi-POV soap opera, basically. Upstairs, downstairs drama. Really fun, really smart, really great world. It starts with a girl falling from the top of the tower, and by the end of book 1, you will know who that is and why. It'll be a trilogy.
Wow.
We're excited.
I'm also hugely excited for that book, and I feel like in general right now I'm excited. This goes a little back to the trend question, but I'm really excited to find more books that feel really fun or funny, or I think quite naturally with the huge bubble of contemporary fiction, there are a lot of books with dead siblings and diseases, as you said, and which were fantastic and really moving. But I think at the moment, I wouldn't mind a slightly more lighthearted book, something like Ally Carter or somewhere in that space. But let's see, what am I excited about? I'm excited about it all. I'm definitely excited about the World War II one I mentioned. It's actually a grounded fantasy about a girl whose mother dies, and her father is off fighting in World War II in the Navy in the Pacific, and so she has to move to her mother's hometown to move in with her mother's childhood friends. And she arrives to this hometown and discovers the town is cursed, and every 7 years the town loses these really basic parts of existence. So it loses the stars in the sky and the sound of music, and so it's this really compelling story because it's got this mystery where she's trying to unravel the origins of the curse, and at the same time she is of course dealing with grief, and so that sense of loss and trying to figure out how to re-find her happiness and her centering. The title is The Disappearances. We went quite literal with it. And it's by Emily Bain Murphy, and it publishes by HMH in 2017. And I think that is a great example for me of something where the voice and the writing just truly felt stand out. It's melancholic, but it's also really ultimately hopeful and beautiful, and it's phenomenal. I love this book.
It sounds great.
So that's one. I have another one called, I'll stick with one.
I was like, I only did one. What are you doing?
And Katie, how about yourself?
I didn't mention on the phone. Actually, so far, it's my favorite book of the year. It's called If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo. It features a transgender heroine. Her name is Amanda, who used to be Andy, and she's 17, and she ends up moving in with her father. Her parents are divorced, to go to a new school her senior year, and she meets a group of friends, and she falls in love with a boy, and it's flashbacks about how she was once Andrew and how she became Amanda. And I personally have never read a fiction or young adult with a transgender character. This book, I started crying by the second chapter. You read it?
Yeah, I read it. It's so.
I was like, I can't.
The editor for a copy and it arrived.
It was like, I don't know. I think I saw it on Goodreads, and because there's a group. Goodreads is a great source where you're like, I want to find books about girls living in the woods or whatever, and they were talking about this book. And I was lucky because as a blogger, I have an access to NetGalley, which is you can get advanced reading copies. And I heard about this book, and the author's transgender too, and it just makes you feel so happy. It's very. It can at some points you're like. I think adults and teens should read this book. It's so uplifting. It's just this feel good. It's written so well, and
It's interesting because the publisher is Flatiron Books and the editor there is really focused on books that can do crossovers. So she's specifically looking for books that are YA books, but they have that crossover appeal. Yeah.
And the way it's written, like if you've never read it and you're kind of wary, it's very comfortable reading. Like I would totally comfortable giving it to my parents, but like you need to read this book because it's like it's not preachy. It's just at the end it's a feel good book.
Yeah, it's not an issue novel.
Oh, not at all. The way it's handled, it's my favorite book this year so far, and I said that in my review, and I was telling on Twitter. Yes, it's very fast read, and the characters, the way her parents are, the way her father is, and her mother, and I'm gonna get emotional because it's just.
Can I give one more book recommendation because I can't help myself, and it's not one of my books, so it's totally okay. Is along similar lines of books that I think maybe in the past would have been considered niche or issue books. Was Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda.
That was my favorite YA.
And it was my favorite YA of last year too. And it's funny, it's got a gay character, it's got a kind of You've Got Mail-esque anonymous love story, and it's just a really great romance, but also has that emotional weight and that kind of, this is something I love in YA and I think is a huge part of the appeal of YA for me is it really is like a wild ride between like really happy moments and really sad moments, and I think that range of emotion is really fantastic.
I think that book in particular is a very good, realistic, reality-based story. I think a lot of, I read it thinking like, yes, this is a real person with real friends who doesn't fit into the automatic boxes that I think a lot of fiction tries to put people in, and it's a realistic romance, like the whole thing. It's great.
A Simon vs. the Homo Sapien Agenda, and it's Balzer and Bray, HarperCollins published
By
it.
Becky Albertalli.
Do we have questions from, let me first ask about our team. So no questions from people outside our conference room. So let me invite people inside our conference room.
I have a ton of questions. But I don't want to, go for it. Okay.
Go, Barbara.
It sounds to me from what everybody's been saying that there is no such thing as a literary YA book. Is that true?
No.
No.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a literary, what you would call a literary YA book? Oh, I'm so sorry. Should I repeat the question?
May as well, yeah.
Okay.
But I don't know that you would recognize it as a literary book in the way you think of an adult book being literary.
I'm just going to repeat the question for the sake of the online audience. The question is there such a thing as a literary YA book?
Yeah, so I mean, I personally actually very much struggle with where to draw that line. Some people can do it, and I'm always like, it's a great book, and that's sort of where I start. I think maybe a book like Spectacular Now would be a good example of a literary YA book, just because they tend to deal with more serious issues a lot of the time, and they tend to be maybe a little less concept-driven and a little more character-driven. So I think that's maybe when you're talking about a quote-unquote literary YA book, it's more about it being character-driven and less concept-driven. I'm trying to think of other... I mean, would you call like My Heart and Other Black Holes more literary?
Maybe a little bit more. I feel like it's a sliding scale. Like there isn't a clear bucket between commercial and literary. I think the way that there's a little bit more of a divide on the adult side, I think it's a trickier scale. I think My Heart and Other Black Holes would be slightly more on the literary side.
But they still have plot.
Like, right.
Oh,
I'll
yeah,
give
Jandy
you
Nelson's
I'll
a
give
great
you
one.
The Sun, I think was the first one when
What was
I'll
that?
Give You the Sun by Jamie Nelson is one of the first ones that came to mind that I would feel more comfortable putting into that literary bucket. A lot of that comes down to voice and execution and focus, I think, of what, speaking to what Pete was saying also, it's really tricky, and it's something I struggle with too, because I'm always talking to agents and saying, what am I looking for? I've always loved commercial fiction, and sometimes, I love literary fiction too. I read both of it, and sometimes when people hear and see my background in some commercial fiction, they think I mean bad writing. Like that is a thing I've had to combat, of like there is really smart smartly executed commercial fiction, and there can be a lot of emotional depth in that space too. And I think a lot of the things that people term literary, I think some of it some people use literary of really meaning quiet, of just not having that splashy concept or big hook the way that some things do. But it's a tricky terminology, and it's a thing. I acquired a book that a debut that I think maybe is one of the most literary books that I've worked on, and it was really refreshing when I talked to the author, and she was like, "Oh, I hate that terminology. I don't like any of that terminology. I don't adhere to it." And I was like, "Oh, great. I'm glad we don't. It puts a lot of weight on things that I think doesn't always do a service."
But I think that also, let's remember the books like The Hobbit, The Giver. I mean, you're talking about contemporary books, but a lot of those books were written as young adult books, and I defy anybody to call those not literary.
I agree completely.
But also, probably a good list of books might be suggested by all of us if we look at some of the library awards. Like if you look at the Newbery, and if you look at the Newbery and the Prince Award, and which is the one that's the adult books that appeal to YA. But all of those books are graded first on their writing standard, so that they also compel teens.
Challenger Deep would be a good one.
Oh, that's a good example.
Oh, Challenger Deep. Oh, I'm glad we're on this roll now. Bone Gap by Laura Ruby is a really great example, I think, of
We won the Prince last year.
It's World War II. Insular. I can't think came out last year, where she's a spy and she's telling her story. She's been
Codename Verity.
Would that be considered? I haven't read it, but I know.
Codename Verity.
I would.
That's
put
a
that
historical.
Yeah, I would put that more literary.
But it's
that one's a bit of an outlier.
No, that's all I can think of at the moment.
See, what's funny is that you guys
But
are
the-
almost afraid to label certain things literary. Afraid it means unsaleable.
I mean, yeah, sometimes that is true. I think we've seen a blend happening in really nice ways, because I think when you speak to, yes, you can look at some of those award winners. I think now some of the books that are winning those awards also have commercial appeal
Exactly.
in ways that they
Which
maybe
is allowed.
traditionally. Right, exactly. And I think it's been really refreshing to see. It's a tricky, but it's a good question.
Do you have one more question?
I have about 3 more, but I want to.
Actually, yeah, I'm sorry, did you have a question? Like one from Yolanda.
Oh, good.
Go ahead.
Okay, good. This is from Yolanda Schweitzer, and she asks, when pitching agents and editors, how do you separate and make book one stand out, all while trying to point out the direction of the series? Should one just focus on book one, or should the series overview be part of the pitch?
Sure. So typically what an agent wants to see, if you have series plans, is a first book that stands alone and truly has its own arc, and then can continue on into a series. Usually, honestly, I don't need to know where the series is going, because I start with book one, and then if I'm interested at that point, I'll ask, hey, do you have any plans for the series? Can I see what you have in mind? And I'll reach out to the author. I have their email, I have their phone number. It can be a conversation. But it's really hard to have a book one that doesn't feel like it, for the most part, stands on its own. It has to be a really big idea to feel like it doesn't wrap things up at the end, I feel like.
And books do have to, any book, whether it's part of a series or not, has got to have a beginning, middle, and satisfying end. No publisher wants to publish a book that feels like a cliffhanger. So I don't think you're doing anybody a favor. Is that a fair statement?
Yep.
And I will say that, not contradicting that at all, but some publishers now are thinking about the author as brand, which means knowing that the author has more books, is interested in writing more books, and has a thought of how those characters might continue to live or evolve, is good information to share, but that does not contradict anything that Pete just said. It's all about the first book standing alone as a strong book, because if that launch pad is not solid and compelling, the story ends right there.
Since we're kind of on this topic, I was curious what advice you would give to a first-time author or someone who is first time to YA. What's your top bit of advice?
Read YA. That is my top piece of advice. Know the community, know what you're entering into, be a part of the community. And I think we do these all the time of talking to prospective authors on the phone, and one of the things I've started doing often, which has ended up having some great conversation, I ask, what's the most recent thing that you read and loved or watched and loved, like just any kind of like, what are you drawn to? It's a good way to get a sense of how aware of the space that they're entering into, and I think it's just hugely helpful to know what's out there, how you fit into it, how you differentiate yourself within that. It's just good to be knowledgeable.
Yeah, I think that's a huge one. It's so interesting. Sometimes you get queries and right away you can tell they don't actually read that much YA because their comp titles are like Harry Potter and the Hunger Games, and they've never gone deeper than that. I think another one is, and I said this earlier, but like don't forget how important craft is. I think you can break the rules, but you kind of have to know the rules you're breaking, and so armor yourself with as many tools as possible. Read books on craft, read books or resources online. I think kidlit.com by Mary Cole, or Mary Cole's website, and she has a book as well, is a really phenomenal resource. And as we said, a lot of what we're calling or reluctantly calling literary fiction is still relatively plot driven, so it's not the worst thing in the world to know structure. And I think a lot of creativity can happen within structure, but you should still armor yourself with those tools as much as possible. And then when you're reading YA, also read critically and like take a pen to the page and figure out how are they making this work? What are they actually doing? Like just dissect the scenes in the overall book and see what it looks like.
And on the flip side, if you don't like something, think about why.
Really good advice.
Because I think that's helpful too, to learn from others' missteps.
My next question is about YA nonfiction. Does nonfiction work in the YA market? Are young adult readers mostly driven by story, or what are some successful YA nonfiction books,
I don't
if any?
do any YA nonfiction. I know, it depends on the kind of YA nonfiction. Like one thing is definitely like the YouTube books, which are actually largely, but not entirely, being published by Atria, as far as I can tell, which is
but
an
a lot
adult
on
publisher.
the adult side.
A lot on the adult side, and
some
then
on the
selling
kids
into the
side.
kids audience.
It's got memoir stuff.
So, but in terms of, do you mean in terms of like topic-driven nonfiction or history
Or memoir? No.
Yes, memoir.
Beyond school.
Yeah,
Common
so
Core.
there are. Go ahead.
Oh no,
I was just gonna say there are some memoirs, but they're pretty rare. Like I remember there was one about Penguin published and was very excited about a girl who finds a guide to being popular from the 1950s and then basically lived her life according to this really outdated guide and wrote a memoir about it.
And was also still a teenager at the time when she did that. I think that is one of the tricky things about memoir, keeping the perspective of YA. It's harder to do. I didn't work on it personally, but my group at HarperCollins published a memoir called Positive about a year and a half ago, I want to say. That was the story of a girl who was born HIV positive and how that's impacted her life. And it was a book that everyone really got behind. It had a great spokesperson, great writing, good story, and it was a tricky thing to do, just being perfectly honest. And it, part of it is the shelving of nonfiction does not make it as accessible as fiction or as intriguing as fiction. I think that's one piece of it. And the world that we live in now, what are you bringing that you can't find on the internet or in an article, long form, or other pieces of information? And I think that's a really tricky piece of it too. I think I would love to see the nonfiction space grow a little bit more in YA and also in middle, like just in children's in general. And it's tricky. You don't want it to seem like you're teaching anything. You don't want it to seem like school. That is, is a piece of it too. And a lot of what is working are these personality-driven nonfiction, where someone is, really into a YouTube personality and they want anything and everything related to them.
And having said that there's not a category in general that's so successful, the bottom line is that, because we're not talking about nonfiction for school and Common Core stuff, but if you have an author who's got a nonfiction story to tell and he's a great storyteller, and again, we've talked enough about voice and how that is important. Why this book should be a YA book would be my question, number one. But let's assume you've satisfied that. The book canon should be written, and it might be a YA book. All right, so because the bottom line is that the story, if the author is a good writer, maybe the category hasn't been established yet. Every one of these incredible, phenomenal categories that we talked about started with a book that didn't exist. The category, there wasn't paranormal romance at one point, then there was the first one. And all of us have worked with distinguished editors that published the first book in a category. And as you were talking, I remember that my son, who's now 28, my memory is that he went from reading Goosebumps, no joke, to reading Hot Zone. Because I was at Random House and I was working on Hot Zone, which was the book about Ebola, nonfiction by Robert Preston. So the book was around. All he knew about it, he was probably like 10 or 12, he was reading Goosebumps. All he heard me talking about, because I was working on the book with a friend, you bleed everywhere when you have Ebola. That's all he had to hear. He picks it up. So my kid went from reading Goosebumps, which is probably middle grade, I guess, right into reading adult books. Hot Zone's not written as a YA book. It is nonfiction, but it'll appeal to that market. So I want to caution anybody from being stuck to labels. If he's a good writer, and if he's got a great story, the market will find itself. He's not going to make it easy for us. But John McPhee didn't make it easy for us either, writing every new book on a different subject, and us having to deal with Barnes & Noble not knowing who to sell it to. That's why these guys are so well paid.
So we were speaking on trends before, and I know one big trend that happened this year, maybe last year, was the we need diverse books sort of trend,
Yes,
and
indeed.
diversity in YA. So I was wondering, when you get queries, when you get submissions, is this what are you actively looking for, these sort of voices in the submissions that you get, and what are the ways that we can make this like not a trend that's gonna die down in a couple of months?
I'm very hopeful that the reason it won't be a trend is that, the need is real. The need won't go away, and a lot of pressure has been put on publishers by We Need Diverse Books, the organization, and that organization won't be going anywhere. And so I think there is a certain amount of there is a lot of correction that needs to happen, and I think that that there is more accountability now, because there is this audience that's saying, hey, we've been ignored, and they're saying it in online, public places where they're now being held accountable. Publishers are now being held accountable. I think I also think that publishers have always wanted these books in theory, but what they're realizing is I think a lot of publishers have thought of them, and I'm 28, so it's not like I have like years and years of experience to point back to, but I think have historically thought of them as niche books, and are realizing that's not fair and that's not right. And so I think HarperCollins' Simon vs. the Homo Sapien Agenda is a good example of a book that earlier I imagine a decade earlier might have been thought of as niche, but was published just as a mainstream book. I think they have another book called The Hate You Give that's coming out that they're putting a ton behind, that has a movie adaptation coming that is about a young black teenage girl who lives in Mississippi, I think. And they're, again, a book that might have been published as niche 10 years ago unfairly is now being given the mainstream treatment, so far as I can tell. And I think publishers and certainly agents are very actively looking for diverse voices. I don't know if anyone was familiar with DV Pit, but it was an online pitching thing that was put together by an agent, and she was able to get a huge amount of agents on board, and also to get editors on board who would sort of signal these posts by saying, yes, we want to see this sort of story. So I'm hopeful that it won't be treated like a trend, because I think for one thing, it's this huge opportunity market-wise, and for another thing, it's just such a necessary correction that I think needs to happen. But it's early days yet.
Yeah, we know is that it's been that this is really one of the. All the statistics show that this is the most tolerant generation, and it does come because yours is a global generation. Yours is the first really, truly digital native generation, and it's a global generation. So there's that. And what's going to happen is more and more matter-of-factly. You're not going to decide to write a book with a character who's black or white, Latino or Asian. It's going to be matter-of-fact because your friends are. The people you see in radio, here on the music is, TV more and more is, music certainly is. And look at the demographics of America. Because ultimately, this is a business we're in. But the demographics, the Caucasian population is going to be the minority population in 10 years. That matters. So when we're talking about diversity, we're not just talking about black versus white. We're talking about the mix of generations. We're talking about transgenerational, transgender, or gender neutral, which is, of course, gender fluidity is something that is, I don't think, going to go away. Or that concept and that acceptance. We're talking about Latino cultures, Asian cultures, and I think that's the signals are that that's something that your generation, that the younger generation kind of accepts as given. So what happens is that at first, in our generation, it was mandated. And then it becomes, an effort. And I think it's going to become mainstream because that's kind of the culture you guys live in.
I think another important thing that, just sort of building off of that we need diverse books is doing is they're also recognizing the problem is not just in terms of the representation of diverse authors, but also within publishing there's just not as much diversity as there should be.
Yeah.
And so they're very actively, taking on that problem by offering internships for diverse people who want to work in publishing. And so I think that too will help. And it's a huge, since it's systemic, it's not something that I think will change overnight, but I do think that maybe the problem has been, people have been made more aware of the problem within publishing, and again, I think that accountability is now a huge part of it as well.
Huge point. I'm going to give one commercial before we break, which is that anybody in publishing is welcome to join the Women's National Book Association, which is a community of people interested in the book, and it's not exclusive to women, by the way. But the Women's National Book Association is about to celebrate its 100th birthday. The Women's National Book Association was founded the same year women were given their right to vote. And it was actually started in a bookstore downtown where women gathered because they were not allowed to join the male booksellers group. So that was the beginning of the Women's National Book Association, which goes on today, still fighting for pay equity, and for some other things that, and building community, which are the two, education community and fairness are basically the hallmarks. But unlike the Women's Media Group, which I think you have to belong to publishing for 5 years, Women's Media Group is open to people who are newcomers to publishing. Because as crazy as the industry is, and as fast as it's changing, well, we've been sitting in this room, probably three different things have happened in our industry. But it's still made up of some of the most incredible people you'll have the pleasure of meeting. So thank you for joining us tonight for the YA Today, and for joining us at Your Expert Nation. And come again, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our speakers.